many familiar names and a few faces. Um, Welcome to our members forum for April. It's not on Tuesday, it's on Wednesday, but that's cool. Um, our program tonight is on the real crisis at the border. Dr. Louis Grabowski is going to be the moderator for this evening. Louis is on our members forum steering committee that actually chooses the topics and recruits the speakers. And he in his real life, his regular job, his day job, he is the director of the Doctorate in Business Administration program at the Robinson College of Business at Georgia State University. Did I say that correctly, Louis?
You did, thank you.
Cool. And he's going to ask the question. So everybody else, please turn off your cameras now, turn off your microphones, pay attention to the two of them. They're going to talk at 6 o'clock and then at about 6:30. Louis, if you will have everybody turn everything back on. How do you want them to ask questions? They should raise their hand or they should just start talking?
Yeah, just raise your hand in the with the Zoom function and I'll call on them.
Okay, and I'm going to tell you, because we had a guy on one of these a couple of weeks ago who said he was waving his hand and nobody saw him. So, I mean, literally he was waving his hand. So
if that happens, by the way, just unmute yourself and call attention.
Okay, anyhow, go to more at the bottom of the Zoom screen. There's a field that says more. Click on that. Let me see, how do you get to it? Click on that. And then it says participants, and where it says participants, there's a little box that says raise hand on the right side of your screen. Okay, and that's how you raise your hand. I'm raising mine right now. And it makes me, if you see where my name is and the participants, it makes my hand a blue
Very
hand.
good.
Okay, Louis, over to you. I'm gonna get off the screen. Bye.
Very good. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for coming. I think we've got I know we have a very interesting program. Brenda and I had a nice long conversation on Saturday about what we were going to talk about, etc. Very, very interesting background. She has sent me her biography, which she's got a lot of accomplishments, and I'm afraid that might take 45 minutes. So I'm going to shortly introduce, give you a short biography, Brenda, if that's all right. Brenda Lopez Romero is a senior assistant district attorney for the Gwinnett Judicial Circuit, leading the Justice and Community Initiative. She was the first American Latina elected to the Georgia General Assembly, where she sat on the Education, Retirement, and State Planning and Community Affairs Committee. She has worked for over 15 years in the legal and political advocacy of immigrants and low-income communities. Formerly, she was a principal attorney handling removal defense and immigration and nationality matters. She also serves as the chairwoman for the Gwinnett County Democratic Party. She holds a law degree from Syracuse University and a bachelor's degree from Georgia State University. I'd get that plug in somehow for Georgia State, so there you have it. I won't go into all the rest of it, but she also has many other accomplishments. So with that, what I'd like to do is have Brenda briefly talk for a few minutes and give us sort of a background on this current situation. And following that, I'll take my rights as a moderator and ask a few questions of Brenda, and then we'll open it up with about 20 to 25 minutes. And then about 5 minutes before about 6:40, I will have stop the discussion and let Brenda have the last word for the evening. So with that, Brenda, please tell us what is the current status of immigrants at the U.S.-Mexican border, and fill us in.
Well, thanks, Louis, for sharing the space with me today and talking about this important issue. And well, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, right, of what we see at the border. We are transitioning still, I would say, to a new administration that has had some positive effects, and then there's been some neutral effects along the lines. But what is most important to highlight now as we go into our specific conversation and specific questions that you or anyone from the audience may have is the fact that the issues that we had in terms of people seeking refuge to the United States for multiple reasons, multiple factors, from both economic, political issues, and also just the ordinary cycle of immigration that comes into our country, that has not changed despite the fact that there has been changes in administration. So when we talk about specifically our US-Mexico border, the reality is that there's still thousands of unaccompanied minors that are still coming, that we have to have a process for them to go through. We still have a lot of people that are seeking entry without necessarily going to a port of entry. And then there's still several, more than 60% of the individuals that seek entry are doing so in a manner that has some sort of legal process that has allowed them to do so. So we are still functioning under the same situation of crisis that we've had, particularly exacerbated by issues of criminality, political instability that we have seen. And then, of course, we had some sort of, just like COVID has affected everyone, it had affected the immigration flow. And we saw a drop in some of those individuals coming, but as the situation with COVID has lessened and there has been more reopenings, not only here in our country, but throughout the world, at least in our hemisphere, we have seen those numbers really start to spike back up to the levels that we were seeing before.
Very good. The first question I guess I've got for you, Brenda, is really, we talk so much about immigration as a problem. And you provided me with an editorial by Hank Johnson in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about immigrants as essential workers. What are the positive effects of immigration, and why should we not view it? We should view it more as an opportunity than as a problem, if you will.
Well, here's the reality. Of course, we know of the history of this country has been precisely individuals not from these lands coming and eventually, whether it's conquering, settling, whatever word you want to use, but obviously coming to lands that are not original to their ancestry. And so there's no way that the United States would have existed without, of course, the natural movement of humans, right, which is our natural tendency to migrate, again, always seeking basic resources of food, shelter, land. And so that's, of course, the origination of this country. And since then, we have always seen generation after generation, a cycle of different type of migration. And even though now we, especially when we focus on the US-Mexico border, we are usually emphasizing those that are migrating from Latin American countries. But the reality is that in prior generations, we have had different types of migration patterns from different countries. And at any of that given time, those individuals that were migrating were seen as not beneficial to the country, despite the fact that they were offering exactly the same benefits that we are now, that we all, and I say we as in anybody that lives here, regardless of whatever immigration status you have, regardless of whether you are first generation US citizen or whether you've been here a couple of generations through your family. The reality is that I think we mentioned already is that I see it really this simple. If you, especially speaking to for us here in the state of Georgia, and I think this is true countrywide, if you have ever eaten anything, any food product, if you have a house built from 1995 or earlier, if you've ever stayed at any of our hotels or have gone to any restaurant in the state of Georgia, you have benefited from immigrant labor. And to be more specific, you have benefited from undocumented labor. And so that in itself, through the labor market and labor source, that is one of the key ways that it's a positive factor of the migration, whether it's through lawful or some sort of legal process. Beyond that, of course, there's the economic impact, and that is, there's a lot of conversations about, do the utilization of resources such as public schools, and some medical services through emergency rooms, despite the fact that the part that is wrong is that things like social welfare programs are not utilized by particularly undocumented individuals because they're not eligible to do so. But there are other costs. But overall, study after study always has shown that the positive net benefit is a positive net benefit for economic impact, right? In terms of, again, not if you're a labor source, that means you're a worker. That means that you're actually not only spending money, but you're also paying taxes at taxes from sales, taxes from obviously property, because even those that rent properties are paying part of their rent is going to pay property commercial taxes as well to their respective communities. And you're also paying your regular income taxes, right? A big misnomer, but the reality is that all immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, for the most part, do file income tax returns, do pay any taxes owed. And that is something that has been habitually done for many years. That being said, I would add to that the other kind of generalized benefits of the general spending power that immigrant communities have. But here in Georgia, if we want to see what that looks like, there used to be nothing at what exists today as South Gwinnett, right? The county that where I live and where I've lived for the last 15 years. Cities, small towns along the DeKalb County Buford Highway area, Buford Highway corridor, which is known for its strong immigrant communities, used to have abandoned shopping centers. And really over the last 20 years those little small towns were revitalized through the small mom and pop immigrant businesses, small businesses that have sprouted as small businesses, but really have really turned the page on what that looks like here in the landscape of our small businesses and economic development in our state. And now, of course, we've seen the cityhood movements of Brookhaven, where I was more or less spent most of my K through 12 years. And of course, Chamblee and Doraville, which were cities at the time, but have now really gone into that mode of gentrification. So we've seen the actual economic impact that has been a positive impact for our communities here in our state alone.
Thank you very much. You mentioned in your opening remarks that practically things really haven't changed that much with the Biden administration. Would you like to expound upon that a little bit?
Sure. So, that is some of the concerns as you've mentioned, as my prior work as an immigration attorney for the last 8 years, quite frankly, as personally having my own history of being a foreign-born U.S. naturalized citizen. It's really a personal situation for me, and I see it both from client side and personal side, that I will tell you that the process is what is different, right? Under the Trump administration, there was a huge difference that we saw from the Obama administration when we transitioned into the Trump administration. Nothing necessarily changed in terms of policy, law, or regulation, and those even executive orders that the Trump attempted to do, for the most parts, were blocked by the courts from actually going into enforcement. And so, even with that, what really changed for us, especially for practicing immigration attorneys, was just simply the process of it becoming ever so more inefficient, the backlogs increasing ever more, requests for information that you've already provided, and also the total lack of any discretion that both trial attorneys for ICE or the immigration judges would exercise. We already had very limited discretion before for them to be flexible, for them to work with us, but it turned into zero discretion under the Trump administration. So that has changed, or slowly changing again, right? Because as can be understandable, human nature, right? If the trial attorneys and the judges were used to working in some capacity, it's hard for them to really kind of set themselves back. And so it's still a slow transition on getting the judges and trial attorneys to bring back some of that discretion that they had, prosecutorial discretion. But the reality is that the limited relief that most immigrants have have once they're trying to apply for benefits, some sort of immigration benefit, whether it be affirmatively seeking an immigration change of status, or if they're already in immigration court or removal proceedings. We haven't had, right? We haven't seen a real push in comprehensive immigration reform, despite the bills that have been introduced in this legislative session. Even for us, and I will say real specific to us here in Georgia, with us really changing the balance of power in Congress through through winning the 2 U.S. Senate seats in favor of considering that gave a balance of power to Democratic control. We have not seen our senators push immigration reform, despite the fact that the immigrant community, particularly the AAPI and the Latino community, came out in historic numbers, twice doubling turnout in prior elections. And quite frankly, that's the margin of victory of which those 2 senators won. So we haven't seen the tangible benefits to these electoral changes. And we haven't seen either sufficient, I would say, executive orders to counter the executive orders that were implemented in the previous administration. One example of that was even the reduction of the number of refugees that would be admitted, that dropped to historic lows under the prior administration, and that this administration has decided to keep, under the suggestion that we're still dealing with issues of COVID. But we were upset when that happened in the last administration. And so I'm equally upset that that continues to be the stance of this administration.
Very good. Interesting. One of the things you and I talked about on Saturday is that I think to the average American, and certainly probably to you, having dealt with it all these years, is I think there's a real confusion as to exactly what the immigration process is. Can you sort of, when an immigrant arrives at the border, exactly what goes on, and what do they apply for, and how much time does it take, and who do they apply to? I mean, just what is the process for an immigrant once they reach the border?
Well, the reality is that there's very limited ways to migrate to the United States, right, in terms of a legal process. They usually the major migration breaks out into 2 components, and that is employment-based visas and then family-based visas that ultimately would potentially turn into becoming green card holders. Now, there's some non-immigrant visas for those that are seeking to come for tourism purposes, for student visas. Obviously, with the university, that's obviously a very important part of our student population that we have, and that was affected also during last administration's different executive orders. And so you have some non-immigrant visas along those lines that in itself have its full complications. But when we think about the people, especially those that are seeking access at the US-Mexico border, we're really looking at people that are intending to migrate to the United States in a more permanent stance, right? They're not just here temporarily to go to school or temporarily to visit. And so for them, it really is those 2 buckets, if any, right? Which is the employment visas, the family visas. Now, those 2 categories of visas, including the diversity visas in the past, are lumped into a cap, a national yearly cap of 600. It's 675,000 number of visas that are available, and then they're subdivided into those different categories, and then there's further subdivided based on countries. But the maximum number that any given country can have of these visa numbers is 7%. So a country such as, for example, the Philippines, India, Mexico, China, which tend to have the largest number of people seeking lawful entry, are capped at that 7% max, and they usually don't get a 7% max, even of those 675,000 visa cap. And so what ends up happening is those 4 countries in particular tend to have backlogs on both the employment visa side and family visa side of anywhere between 5 to 19 years, depending on your category that you're applying for. And so, if you're coming to the border and you're going to seek that's not really an option, right? you're not just going to come to the border and then they're like, hey, wait around. If you even qualify or are eligible for any of those visas, you're not going to sit around at the border for that. So what you see in the US-Mexico border, especially in these last few years, as we were saying, since 2014 going forward, is a lot of people seeking asylum. And again, multiple factors on why they're seeking asylum, primarily political and interrelated with that economic reasons for that migration. But some of that flow from the asylum seekers is not something that happened in 2014. They're not political issues that occurred in 2014 or since then, but rather it's been the historic issues of the destabilization of a lot of these, particularly Central American countries. Some of the political issues that have occurred in particularly Venezuela, for example. We've seen obviously a large increase of Venezuelans seeking refuge since the Chavez regime. And so, that's who you see at the border, and some of the issues that we're experiencing with some of the crisis that we see there, particularly as it relates to unaccompanied minors, or those that are under 18 that are coming to the border, that are trying to flee from violence, primarily from drug and gang cartels. We were mentioning, right, that a lot of the young people that come, especially the young boys, are coming because, and by young, we're not necessarily talking about, and we do see 5-year-olds and young kids of that age, but what we saw most of, and what we continue to see, is those of more teenage years, young boys of teenage years that are being sent as unaccompanied, attempting to flee, being recruited precisely into these drug and gang cartels, because the recruitment goes something along the lines of like, you join us or we kill you and or your family. And so in attempts to prevent being sucked into those criminal entities, they instead, parents many a times are choosing to send their children alone to the US-Mexico border. So, and then of course, we've always seen the flow of those that are attempting to enter without authorization. And many of those, have been, again, exacerbated by lots of the political issues in Latin America, but also there has been an increase of individuals that have had a harder time under the last administration to come through, for example, a tourist visa and then overstay, which is something that quite frankly happens about 40% of the time of people that come in with tourist visas, and or just simply some of the restrictions, right, with the Muslim bans and other restrictions under the prior administration, a workaround that issue, because again, they're facing a lot of both civil and political unrest in their own home countries, are actually flying in or arriving in primarily Mexico and then going through Mexico to the US border. And that these are individuals that are, primarily coming from Southeast Asian countries, from African countries, that are finding that way as a workaround from some of the limitations and bans that we saw under the prior administration.
I see. One quick question, and then I'll open it up for the audience. I have many more, but the asylum seekers, are they subject to the 675,000 limit, or could that technically be limitless?
Well, yes. So no, they are not limited to that cap. That cap is limited to, again, for those that are seeking employment and family-based visas, and some of the diversity lottery that we had. And so no, the asylum seekers aren't limited in that. There's no cap, but what is limited is the number of judges and the number of facility spaces and beds for individuals to come. And that's where we've seen such a backlog as well, even before COVID, right? Of course, during COVID, the backlog grew even further, but even before COVID, we've always had a large backlog in the courts. And then under the last administration, we saw that increase ever more so. And so that is part of the situation where, because they are asylum seekers, you don't want them to be detained while their process is being ran. And so in especially with the prior administration, once they were checked for criminal background, they would be released to a sponsor in the United States so that they could continue their process through the immigration courts and their asylum hearings through the immigration courts, but in a non-detained capacity.
Interesting. Thank you. I'll open it up now to the audience. Again, use the chat function here, use the raise your hand function to ask a question, and I will call on you, and then you can unmute yourself. And if I miss you, just unmute yourself and yell at me. I'm used to it. Yes, Dr. Valentine. Keith. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Keith. Keith, we can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
How's that?
Ah, much better. Much
Sorry.
better.
So if I understood correctly, there are 600, only allow 600,000 a year. Is that right? The visa number again?
675,000, right? That are divided. The formula gets slightly complicated in the division, but it gets divided per different visa types. And sometimes there's different percentages of allocation to different countries, but no country can have more than 6% of those 765,000. I'm sorry, 675,000.
So how is the allocation to Canada and Mexico, our nearest neighbors?
Well, that is part of the problem with the backlog, right? That they are close to having the same allocation, but yet you don't have the same number of requests from each of those two countries. So, and we think of those two as our border countries, which is again, right? That's very true. But Iceland has the same allocation to what Mexico and India have. And so that is where you get these extraordinarily backlogs for those 4 countries.
Wow.
And I'll leave, but is that higher or lower than it's been?
The visa cap number?
Yep.
It was increased slightly about maybe 10 or so years ago, but it really hasn't been. These visa caps were set in legislation about 30 years ago and really haven't been modified since then. Not how you allocate them, not if you're going to distinguish between country populations or anything along those lines.
Good question, Keith. Ambassador Shapiro, you've got a question?
Yes, always have questions. Okay, the president tonight is going to speak, according to the press, and propose an immigration reform. Brenda, did they call you and ask your advice? Do you have any idea what's going to be in his proposal tonight?
Well, they definitely didn't call me, but quite frankly, even during the election cycle, I kept telling folks that there was no reason to reinvent the wheel, and they haven't really reinvented it, but they've made some modifications. And but the general premise of the bill is very similar to a piece of legislation that almost passed in 2012, 2013, that would provide a path. And I always like to clarify a path to becoming a green card holder, right? Because a lot of people call it a path to citizenship because I guess it sounds prettier, it sounds nicer. But the reality is that these legalization reform bills really are about providing people an opportunity to apply for a green card. And upon getting their green card, then they can become U.S. citizens.
So it's only for DACA recipients that the proposal would not change any other aspect of U.S. immigration law. Is that right? Right,
exactly. So that is one of the key difference, right? Because the issue is that we have now, I guess, somewhere between 10 to 11 million undocumented individuals. And that is not sufficiently covered by those that are currently DACA recipients or would be DACA recipients. And so that is a key limitation to what was was proposed. In the prior bills, what was proposed was a general legalization across the board that would have expedited those that have already been DACA or TPS recipients, but that's not where we are. And quite frankly, that's where I think we should be. And I think that, again, with the wins that we had, particularly here in the state of Georgia, immigration reform is an important topic to our immigrant community, because we are a very, we're a very much foreign-born or first-generation immigrant community here that is going to need to be incentivized to vote again in 2022. And these half measures, because I think of them as best of half measures of only legalizing DACA or TPS recipients, is just simply not enough, and it will not really reduce the issues that we're discussing that arise at the border. So yes, it's not it. I guess if we're going to call it a first step, but I don't think that we should be in the process of doing first steps at this point, particularly with the switches that we saw happen in this electoral cycle.
Thank you, and thank you, Ambassador. Eric, you have a question?
Yeah, this is obviously a very broad, complex issue, and it's an issue that's plagued administrations of both parties for a long time. I'm just kind of curious as to what you think the right solution is, the right path is to keep our borders secure from undocumented immigration, et cetera, but still be fair to those that seek to come to this country, because obviously for virtually all of us are immigrants or descendants of immigrants at some point. So, but we have a very desirable country, a very desirable economy. I mean, virtually the whole world would love to come here and live if they could. So what do you think the solution is?
Well, one of the reasons that, or the way that I see comprehensive immigration reform, what we were discussing before about making it so that it becomes a more of a generalized legalization of those that are currently undocumented here in the United States, is because the way I see it, it's sweat equity, right? It's those quasi contracts where in our everyday civil world, you cannot benefit from someone's labor even if you didn't officially sign a contract with them, right? The courts would ask you to compensate them for their labor. And so for me, I see the context of legalizing the 11 million here in the United States as that sweat equity issue. There was significant, particularly in the early 90s and the early 2000s, there was significant pull factors, right? It wasn't push factors from their home countries, but a lot of pull factors. My father still, tells me where in their mid 80s, late 80s, early 90s, literally companies would have buses, companies, whether it was construction, whether it was agriculture companies, would have buses at the border, literally. And whoever got on the bus got taken to work, right? And so when you have those kind of pull factors, again, we've benefited from them. So that's the context of what do we do with this 11 million people here in the United States. And again, what do we do is what we are mentioning with some of these pieces of legislation that are currently being introduced and have been introduced in the past, which is you provide a way that if an individual has had 5+ years of community ties to the United States, can show tax filings, can show all positive factors of like, what have you been doing here in the country? Then, and of course, the criminal background checks and stuff that, that's obvious that has happened. That happens with every single process that you do. That's a given. And so, to make sure that we also measure our safety of the country. Now, the other question that you were discussing about sort of people coming in a way that's unlawful, then that relates to the first topics that we were discussing, which is what do we do to actually make there be a legal process to enter the country, right? Because there is no legal process to come do landscaping. There is no legal process to come be a housekeeper. There is no legal process to do many of the jobs that you see a lot of that pull factor for the labor source. And so even with agriculture, right, we do have agriculture visas where people come to work in our agricultural industry. But again, the caps are so limited that even farm owners here always say that they just don't have sufficient labor, and not even utilizing some of the H visas that are available for agriculture. So we have to, quite frankly, I think we need to remove the visa caps outright. At the best end, but at a minimum, what we need to do is definitely increase those visa cap numbers, and also make the formula be smarter, where you don't cap every country the same, where you actually take into account what the flow of migration is from those countries, so you don't have these excessive backlogs. And so, those are the things that we need to fix future wise, so that we don't have these issues of people coming in a way that might come in unlawfully. Or, like I mentioned, 60% of the people that come in with a tourist visa end up overstaying their visa. That's where you get the vast majority of the undocumented people. Most people, again, the issue that we think about is simply unlawful entry at the border, particularly at the US-Mexico border. But the reality is that vast majority of the people that are undocumented because they entered through a lawful means and then overstayed their non-immigrant visas. So we have to fix both ends, right? We have to fix the sweat equity issue of those that are already living here and have already contributed, and that we have all personally benefited from their presence. And we also have to fix so that we don't continue to have this cycle of individuals having, being either pushed or pulled to enter in a way that is not without a legal procedure to do so.
Thank you very much. Again, a good question, great response. Amanda, we'll go to you, and then Mr. Hoffman, you, and then I think we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, Brenda. Thank you so much. And thank you, Louis. I have a quick question about President Biden asked Vice President Harris to work with Mexico and the countries of the Northern Triangle, so that's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to address the root causes of migration from that area, from Central America. What do you think are her chances for success? And what do you think that we can be offering these countries to help them, to stabilize them, their governments, their political system, and to give those migrants hope to stay home and to not make the dangerous journey?
Yeah, I would definitely say that the situations are very different now between Mexico and the Central American countries, right? I think that for Mexico, one of the key things to focus on, the economy has gone relatively well. And Mexico has not experienced political unrest that we saw last primarily in the early 80s, and the devaluation of the peso also in the early 80s. So since that time, there's been steady improvements, sharp improvements. And so I think that for the context of Mexico, what we need to focus on as the United States in terms of providing greater opportunity access is focusing on education opportunities for those for Mexican nationals, and also continuing to increase the opportunities to be able to have that economic direct import to the United States. And what I mean by that, of course, there were some changes to NAFTA to now the United States-Mexican agreement, but those didn't necessarily fortify a greater exchange of our economics, right? Of course, Canada and the United States, Canada and Mexico, as we've already mentioned, are not just our border neighbors, but they are also basically our number one and our number two import-export of you name a product, and that's likely Canada or Mexico are gonna be one or number two in whatever sort of import export of any product. And so we need to focus on how to make that more efficient and effective so that the economic viability of both countries continues to improve. As it relates to Central America, I think that there is Same thing, actually, definitely, education opportunities always go a long way. Education opportunities in our own country go a long way in helping some of our own public safety issues and public issues. But in addition to that, I think there has to be also a lot of work that needs to be done with the issues of drugs, the issues of gangs, and another thing to look inwardly in terms of the drug issues is our own demand for it in our countries, right? Because the reason that there is that influx of drugs is because the demand for them is here in the United States.
Thank you. Brenda, we're almost out of time, so your response to the next one has to be quick. Mr. Hoffman, what's your question?
Well, isn't it true that the reports that these people, many people are on the border seeking asylum, in a sense misleading? Because as you know, asylum is clearly defined by statute as someone who has to prove that they will be persecuted by the government, or someone the government is unable or unwilling to control because of their political opinion, race, membership in a particular social group, nationality, or religion. It can't be looking for a better life. It can't be looking for a better economy, and it can't be a marriage that is broken up and you're trying to get away from your spouse. So isn't it the case that very, very few of those people are actually eligible for asylum, and there needs to be another route?
Well, in terms of what you mentioned, what generally asylum is, yes, those are the general 5 categories, right? Now, the particularized social group, that is something, again, that has evolved back and forth on what that means. And, that something that was considered in the past, for example, that last example that you gave has been gender violence, particularly as it relates to domestic violence. And that is something that under the last administration was effectively removed as a particular social group. Things along the lines of, in the past, we had seen even some immigration court decisions and appeals really to the BIA that did allow for certain types of recruitment, seeking certain types of individuals to be considered a particular social group. That again got removed under the last administration as an option. So there are some of these issues again that are not, like you mentioned, the economic reasons, but rather the issues of again the political and social security issues of of their home countries that could have potentially qualified under asylum prior to the last administration. And so yes, it's a little bit of both of what you said. Now, again, we did say over and over, there are people that are still coming for economic reasons, whether it's push factors because of economic issues in their home countries, or whether they're pull factors of the pool of the labor sources that we need here. That also continues to be true. That has not changed, right? Over the last, like I said, the initiation of what we know the United States to be. But there are changes that have happened to the asylum laws and what asylum is that really have cut back that as an option for those that are currently, most currently seeking asylum. And I think that some of the changes that need to be done in terms of legislation is precisely make some changes into what is and mainly what is asylum, right? And it's really been created basically case by case, decision by decision, circuit by circuit. And I think that we do need to revamp what the definition of asylum is, and also revamp maybe even our own perception as to what asylum is. There's a lot of people that are starting to call for climate refugees, right? Those that have to leave their home countries because their areas have been affected by climate change and what has been patterns of agricultural growth, for example, or the deforestation of certain areas has left people with no other choice but to migrate, whether it's migrate internally within their own countries or migrate outside of their countries. So that is, I think, a next question for all of us to consider is, can we increase, can we change our perception about what asylum should or shouldn't be? Because when, again, the asylum laws were written, we were talking about the issues of, communism, socialism, capitalism, democracy. And that's why we focus so heavily on issues of persecution based on religion and based on political opinion, because at the time that the asylum laws were being written, those were the pressing issues of the time. I think the pressing issues of our time have become, have started to change or have changed. And I think that our asylum law should be modified to the needs that we have today.
Thank you very much, Brenda. I just saw a chat from Eric that said this would be a great panel discussion over a longer period of time, which I totally agree with. We're running a little bit over just in 1 minute, and I will cut you off if you go beyond 1 minute. But what would you like the takeaway to be from tonight's program?
Well, I hope that maybe Amanda, Ambassador may later on share, but for me, it's really quite simple. What can we do requires of your time, talent, and treasure. And I think that's true for just about anything, right? Many a times we always say we want to do something, and that's all we say, or that we're concerned about whatever X thing is happening. And so what I would suggest is give of your money, right? And there's a lot of local organizations that are doing incredible work for immigrant advocacy generally, some for immigration laws, some of them in the context of greater integration of immigrant communities, some that provide direct programs and services, and some that do all of the above. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Galeo, CPACs, number of local Georgia-based organizations that are working here locally and have been doing so for the last 10 to 20 years. So I would say give of your time by volunteering with these organizations, give of your money by volunteering to these organizations, and then of course your talents, whatever you might have. And I think that is the most direct and effective way that you can do something meaningful that actually will affect a one person, right? And then of course there's the globalized things of what we can do, and that is continuing to push our senators, continuing to push our Congress to move some of this legislation forward, even if, again, might be the first step or first step and a half, but something that we need to do effectively. And even though, COVID is a difficult situation for all, has caused a difficult situation, when we get back to a normal routine, I don't mean just emailing your senator, right? I don't mean just emailing the president or the White House. I mean literally going to the US Capitol, going to your state legislature and talking to legislators directly. There's nothing that makes a greater impact to an elected than for you to speak to them directly face to face. And so once we get back to some normalcy of that, I definitely ask you to be real proactive in your advocacy. That is not just from your keyboard.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating, interesting, and thank you. So I know you're busy, and thank you so much for your time. The organizations that you mentioned and you sent to me, by the way, Fernanda, we are going to send that out in some way or form, or have. I've forgotten how that works. And I'll now turn it over to you, Charles, to wrap up and give your usual commercial.
Yeah. Thank you, Louis. And Brenda, thank you so much. This is such a super complicated topic. It really is. And not just complicated, this understanding it and the subject matter of it, but politically it is a hugely complicated topic. So that George W. Bush tried to push immigration reform through Congress and got nowhere with it when his party had majorities in both houses. He couldn't get his own party to support it, and this is just going to be super difficult. And everybody agrees it needs to change, but nobody can agree on how it should change. So, wow. Anyhow, thank you so much, Brenda, for explaining this to us. Louis, thank you. You've been a great moderator. We've got some upcoming programs that Louis is referring to that I got to pitch on Monday at 1:30. Usually our daytime programs are at noon, but this is at 1:30. We have Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger talking about the changes in the electoral law. He spoke last July. Since then, he has become a national figure, attacked by the right, the left, and everybody in between. We even got our own hate mail today. How could we be hosting a program with him? So it's going to be cool, interesting. That's Monday at 1:30. On Tuesday of next week, we have got B. Perez, who is the Senior Vice President, Global Chief Communications Officer at the Coca-Cola Company, talking about Coca-Cola's investment in female entrepreneurs. It's really a great story that Coca-Cola has to tell. Please join us on Tuesday at noon with Bea Bettis from the Coca-Cola Company. And we got a whole bunch of other stuff coming up, and we'll send you emails about it. I don't want to bore you with it now because it will just, you won't remember it. So next week, Monday, Brad Berger. Tuesday, we have Bea Bettis. Both going to be great programs. Please join us then. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Louis, thank you again for moderating. Brenda, thank you again for trying to help us understand this really complicated issue. Thanks so much. Everybody have a good evening, and we've all got to turn the TV on at 9 to watch the State of the Union address, right? Cool.
Thank you,
Bye-bye, y'all.
Brenda. Thank you very much.